So I'm in app.jsx file, and I want to start with the last statement, which is actually React DOM.render. This should give you a more bigger picture overview before we start implementing individual components. So what we're using here, we're using React router, and it looks very similar like any other React component. It has router, and then inside it has routes. And each route has a path and component. You can also have more attributes, aka properties, but at the bare minimum, path and component. Path is your URL, the product/ID, for example, and the component would be the React component that would be rendered when this URL is triggered, when the user is on this URL using his or her browser. And I have also an extra property handler by, so you can pass any properties you want. In this case, it's a function. And then you can have nested routes. As you can see, we have cart and product and index inside of the app. Then I have also a sibling to the app route, which is checkout. So what it will do, all the routes inside of the app, they will inherit the app. Some of the elements like header and we would see a paragraph, and then the checkout would be completely different. Checkout would be that invoice page. It would not have the header, it would not have the description. Every other pages would have that description because they're children of the app. So now I have React DOM.render. This is the very last statement in this app, in this script file. So I want to go back to the top and start with imports. So I would import all the necessary dependencies that I will be using, all the necessary modules. And I'm using ES6 or ES 2015 style. Import, and then the curly braces, that's called destructuring. And the import itself, import from, that's the ES6 syntax for module imports. So I'm importing create hash history and use base name from history module, and I'm importing React and React DOM, and then I'm importing a whole bunch of modules, or I would say objects or classes from React router using destructuring. You can read more about ES6 destructuring in the appendix of the React Quickly book. Then I'm declaring constant history. The constants never change. You cannot reassign const history to something else. The official documentation also say they are immutable, but if you try to change it, usually you would get an error. So one quick thing to notice here, these are npm names. So even this is a front-end module, front-end script, we're using npm names, and Webpack will intelligently get those dependencies from npm modules and make them available in the bundle. So all these dependencies from npm, from server-side npm modules, they would be available on the client side on the browser in that one file, bundle.js. The reason why you need one file, because usually it's faster to get just one file, even if it's like super large. You can also do chunking with Webpack, but the Webpack is out of the scope of this book. The next object I would just paste. I would not type it to save ourselves some time. It's just a list of books. I have path to images, I have unique IDs, I have titles, I have URLs. Nothing fancy. If you want to enhance this app, you can get this information from the server. You can use backend as a service, something like parse.com or Firebase. Doesn't really matter as long as you have this data from somewhere. You can use Reflux, you can use Express.js and MongoDB or Meteor. Now I want to define the items in the cart. It's going to be just an empty object for now. And I'm using let, which is a new var, but only it respects blocks. The next object would be the model component. So this is that model that opens up from the home page. The way it's implemented, we're using some CSS styles to position that box, that model box, and the CSS styles come from the styles object. As you can see, I'm defining this as a property on the model component or model class. Again, CSS properties in React must be without dashes. They must be valid JavaScript names. So if you have, for example, box shadow, it would be not box dash shadow, it would be box shadow with capital S without dashes. So I've starting to render, and the render syntax, it's actually ES6 syntax. So as you see, there's no colon, no word function. It's just more eloquent way to define. So you can mix and match. We didn't use ES6 class here, but we're using ES6 declaration for the method render. And then in the return, I'm using something called link. That's coming from React Router, and it's using toProperty. And props.returnTo would be the property supplied to the model. So this back button basically will return us to the home page, to the storefront. One key thing here to notice is that we are rendering this.props.children. So the model will re-render whatever children the parent is passing to him. In this case, it would be the product image. So let's move on. We have few more components to implement. A heading is a stateless component, and I'm using ES6 fat arrow function here. I love fat arrows. I love them in CoffeeScript. I love them here. Too bad ES6 didn't borrow skinny arrow from the CoffeeScript. It would have been so much better than typing word function. So stateless functions, all they do is just return some either JSX or HTML, meaning they would return a component or a regular HTML. They don't have API, they don't have states. They're basically a dumb, stateless, very declarative components. Use them as much as you can, because the more of the stateless components you have, the easier it is to read your code, to test it, to debug it. So far so good? Okay, now let's implement the shopping cart component, which is rendered at /cart URL. Again, I'm using ES6 style for the render function, no word function, no colons. And in that div, I'm getting cart items, getting the keys from that object, and checking if the length is 0. If it is, I need to output that the cart is empty, and that's it, we're done. If it's not empty, then I'll have to loop and look for the items. Each item, I'm mapping it in the iterator. I would be using item index list. Those are arguments. And notice I'm using a fat arrow here because I need to point to this keyword. Remember to use key when you're using lists. Without it, React will complain. It's good for optimization. So what's happening here, I also need a link to the checkout and to the home. Again, I'm using that component that comes from the React router. It's basically a glorified anchor tag. It's nothing more. And I can style it with Twitter Bootstrap classes as I would style a button or a link. Let me get rid of this extra element. It was inserted by the autocomplete. The next component is a checkout. Checkout would be a component outside of the app. It would not have the heading, which we would implement in the app. Again, I'm using render with ES6 style. Let instead of var. Now we're using let in ES6 to respect the blocks, the block scoping. And in the return, the heading is invoice, and then I have this table with the class of table and table border. Those are Twitter Bootstrap classes. They just make this table look a little bit nicer. Then again, I'm getting the keys from cart items object. Remember, it's an object, it's not an array. We cannot iterate over an object. We can iterate only over array with .map. .map is a function of the array class. So we need to get the keys. It will be an array, and then we're iterating over those keys, but we can use the keys, which is item now, on the cart items object. So that's how I'm getting the quantity, because cart items, curly braces item, is a quantity of each particular book in a shopping cart. So I need the total. I'm counting the total. And then products, square braces item dot title. That's me using the key of that, the ID of that product from the product object to get that title. Okay, so now what I want to do, I want to implement the app component. That will be probably the smartest component of all of them. And it would act as a layout as well for most of the other routes, for /products, /cart. I'm using component will receive props to implement some logic which I will need to determine if this is a model or not a model. Because remember, this app component is also used for models. Next, props. It's a property that is passed to us in the component will receive props. And then next props.location, that's something that React Router adds, so we can get the state.model and state. Those are some of the properties which are passed to the model if it's a model, so it will be true. And then basically we're saving the current children in the previous children. So that's how we can see, even on a model screen, we can see on the background, still see the home page and other books. Then in the render, again, we're checking that if it's a model, is model. We're using the state.model from the location, and also checking for previous children. If it's a model, then we do one thing, and then if it's not, basically it's either a home page or something else. So we use that heading, we remember the stateless component, and then we render whatever children we have. So now we're checking for the model. If it's model, I'm using ternary condition here, then implement the model component and pass is open to true, you always need to wrap boolean in curly braces, and the return to, use the return state.return to. So that would be the back button's prop. And then if it's not a model, it's just empty. Okay, so we don't get that model component if it's not a model. The next component would be index. This index component is basically the home page. It's the /route. And it's inside of the app. So all we really need to do here is to provide some copy, which just a paragraph with text, and then a link to the cart. I'm using btn-danger from Twitter Bootstrap. Then we have a div. This is where we actually render the nice covers of the books. So we iterate over the product array, and one by one we create a link to /product/id. And this is the ES6 interpolation, which aka is string template. Basically a nicer way than using plus, quote, etc. So this is important. The state we're passing, it's model true. So this is the link on the home page, which we click and then the model opens, because the state is model true. And then inside of the link I have an image, and the style uses double curly braces, first for the object, second for outputting a variable in the React. So that's it. Let's close all the tags and parentheses. The next component is product. That would be like an individual detailed view of a book in our store, in our bookstore. I have this method, handler by. In this method, I'm assuming that I already have this property from a route. So any property that we specify in a route, such as handler by, will end up in this.props.route. And I'm just passing the ID of this book. Don't get confused that I'm using the same name, handler by, handler by. One is coming from the route, another is just a local method on this component. And in our by button, we would use the local version. The local version will invoke the property from the route with the ID. So the paragraph with the title, again I'm using this products array. We have link to the cart, and when we click, it will trigger the local handler by. So this is our by button. And you can also alternatively pass the state, but we're not really using the state. We're using handler by to trigger the purchase, the addition of this item into the cart. So you can also do that by passing the state to the cart. Okay, so we're almost there. The final piece of the puzzle is the handler by. It's just a function. I define it with a fat arrow, ES6 style. So if we already have that item in our cart, just do +1. If we don't have that item, remember cart items, it's an object. If we don't have that property created and the initial number is 1. So this way we can add more and more books, and it's not going to be another line in an object, another property. It's going to just keep adding that number. So this is pretty much it. Let me save this file, and now we can go to the terminal. So there are two ways you can do this build. First of all, you can start the development server. The development server obviously will compile everything and bundle up for you, and then open the port. Yep, that's right. It's a new session. Yeah, so as you can see, we can make purchases. We can check out. So this is good. But what if you want to just use some other web server, maybe your own Node.js server or Apache or Nginx? You can also do that because we already have the code in bundle.js. And if you look at package.json, you have this build command. So basically, all you need to do, npm build, it compiled. If you want more information, you can copy this string and execute Webpack like this. Because sometimes you might have errors in your config file. You don't know what's happening, npm is hiding for you. So this is better. It shows you time. It's actually almost 2 seconds. It's not that fast. Okay, the most important thing here is that the bundler bundle.js is compiled. So now we use static. It's listening on port 8080 on our local host. Okay, and it's working. So that's how you can implement routes with hash history and React Router. Thank you for watching. So this is the last project in our book. If you didn't get the book yet, if you're just watching this on YouTube or somewhere else, make sure to get the book. It has twice or thrice more examples and projects and descriptions. And thank you for watching again. Have a great day.